Thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest in these interesting ideas, I hope, for interesting times, I think we know. And thank you to Powell's, a great community institution. I'm really honored to be here. Well, the context for our book is growing inequality in America. So what's the story of growing inequality? An important thing to understand, I think, when you ask that question is the difference between income and wealth. And we really focus on the question of wealth as our sort of starting point for the argument that we develop in our book. Wealth is the assets. Wealth is the thing that gives people a foothold in our economy, in a sense gives people a chance at a good life. It gives people the ability to move up socially. Income is subject to all kinds of pressures, and if you don't have wealth, when your income goes down or you lose your job, you sink. And so having assets at the center of the analysis is really important if we're really going to get to the heart of the question of growing inequality. So what is the distribution of wealth today? What does it look like? There are many ways of looking at that, and any given way is only a snapshot. So here is one snapshot that I think is particularly relevant. This comes from the year, I think it's 2001, and it's from Federal Reserve data on assets. So that year, we had a total wealth, total assets in the private economy of about $30 trillion. How was that divided up? The top 5% of households held 13.6 trillion out of the 30. The bottom 90%, basically most of the rest of society, held 13.9 trillion out of the 30. So basically, the very richest held as much as the rest of us. Even more disturbing, the bottom half of our population, 150 million people, and most importantly, the people who need the assets, the people who need that leg up, the people who need that foothold, the people who need that security in order to achieve the American dream, they only held 1.8 trillion out of the total. That's less than 6%. So the people who need the assets held 6%. The people at the very top held about 50%. That's the kind of inequality that we're talking about. Wages are important too. So what's the story of wages over the last, say, 25 years? Many of you know wages on average have stagnated for most workers, for most Americans, for most households. For some, those without high school diplomas, wages have fallen significantly. Even more disturbing is the divergence of wages from productivity. So in the era, sort of the golden age of American capitalism, which was roughly 1950, early 1960s, and even going up to 1980, you look at the wages and productivity rising together. So total productivity gains over that 3-decade period was about 90%, pretty good growth, actually much better than we've had lately. Total wage gains, average wage gains, was about 89%. So there you have a one-to-one correspondence, wages rising with the growth of the economy, wages rising with the tide, just deserts. Since 1980, productivity and wages began to diverge, and virtually all of the gains from our productivity started to flow to the top, certainly the top 20%, possibly even the top 5% or the top 1%. So wages and productivity diverge. For example, since 2000, we had about 20% total productivity gains and less than 1% of wage gains. So wages and productivity have been severed. A whole lot of people have been completely cut off from the appreciating value of our society. Now, in our view, and at the sort of core of the book, all of this has happened, or much of this has happened, because the moral will being critical and central to develop the political will to change things. The moral will to prevent these inequalities was systematically weakened by a flawed understanding of wealth creation. Not just starting at the distributional questions, but actually our basic understanding of how wealth is created. And with this flawed understanding of wealth creation is a correspondingly flawed morality that justified the growing inequality. The mistaken morality grows out of the mistaken understanding of wealth creation. And that's the problem that we seek to rectify in the book. And the basic problem, as I would put it, and this came out, I think, pretty clearly at the end of the 2008 presidential campaign, the kind of dichotomy that I'm about to describe. So on the one hand, this is where the flawed assumptions lie. On the one hand, you have sort of a pure economy, which is sort of the realm of isolated individuals acting out of their rational self-interest and by some kind of natural justice getting rewards that are exactly proportionate to the value of their contributions. And so that's the pure realm of the market economy, and it's something that's good. Then there's a bright red line between that and the bad realm of government and redistribution and socialization, where people who have political power have certain ideas of how to put that wealth to better uses, and so they tax it away from the people who naturally deserve it and give it to the people who don't naturally deserve it. The problem with this view, which is essentially that there's a pure economy and then there's the government that tries to socialize things, is that it completely leaves out of the account the many ways in which and the degree to which everything that's going on in the private economy is in many ways highly socialized to begin with. So let me give you an example of what I mean. If you look at our total economic growth over the 20th century, and the fact it's the real growth, having more output per person, that's what translates into rising living standards. And it was only in the 20th century that we began to have that. So looking at that growth story, the value of our public education systems, a collective endeavor of parents, of students, of school systems, of local policy making, of teacher training, of people who develop curricula, of legal litigation and law and statutory law to desegregate schools, was responsible, contributed 15 to 20% of our total growth in the 20th century. Came from the investments in schools, which in turn translated into a more productive workforce. So 20% of our growth, and on a per capita basis, 20% of every paycheck that we get came from public schooling. We don't have, line items for that on our paychecks. We have line items for the taxes that take our money away. We don't have a line item that says, oh, and by the way, 15% of this came from society.